Greetings all, and welcome to another session here for learning about TESOL methods and materials. Today we're going to be talking about lesson planning, and we're also going to be talking about techniques that you use in the development of lessons. So we're going to take a look at some components here of a lesson plan, how to make one. Let's go take a look at what a format would be right now. The format of a lesson plan, there are a variety of things that you'll want to have in a lesson. Sometimes we use the word a unit or a chapter or activities. But a lesson generally has a variety of elements that are combined together. These include things like goals, objectives, materials, procedures, assessments, and extra classwork. Now, when you're developing a lesson, again, the goals are going to be more general. Your objectives should be measurable. And so when you're creating a lesson, make sure that the objectives that you have are measurable in some way. If you're dealing with speaking, make sure that whatever you're doing, you can analyze, you can assess to see whether they've met that objective or not. Make sure it's measurable. Materials that you use, it's going to depend on what it is that you're using, but you should list what those materials are. You should list the procedures. You should create or have an assessment so that you can verify whether you can verify what the students have learned. I look at all of these things and I think to myself, you know, this kind of looks like the components of a recipe. You know, a recipe has goals, it has an objective, right? Making whatever food it is there are materials, they call them ingredients. There's procedures, right? The instructions for putting the thing together. There's an assessment, how good something tastes or how well it looks or how does it present. And so it's not so dissimilar from a recipe. Now, obviously, there are other things that are involved. When you're dealing with these, you've got to deal with the other variables that wouldn't be in cooking, but when you look at this, it kind of looks like a recipe. And you'll want to make sure that you have things listed out so that somebody else can reproduce what you are doing, what you're creating. If you look on the internet, there are hundreds of places where you can get already made materials. They should include these components, and if they don't, well, then you may want to look somewhere else. Make sure that you have objectives, make sure that you have an assessment, and I always try to keep some type of extra classwork involved because maybe it's too easy for the students. Maybe they get bored with the activity and they want to do it some other way. Maybe you need a plan B. So you always want to have some type of extra work around. Some guidelines for lesson planning. Well, how to begin? Well, script writing should include the introduction, the directions, rules, anticipated problems, oral testing techniques, and a wrap-up. In other words, when you're going to write out a lesson plan, you also want to include an introduction that tries to summarize what this lesson is, right? So I'm going to try to have a little bio or a summary at the beginning. You'll want to have directions, like I mentioned earlier, and rules. You may want to list possible problems that you might be running into just because of your own experience. You'll want to have some form of a wrap-up if you're going to be dealing with that. If you're going to be doing oral testing, you'll want to include that as well. Make sure that when you're developing a lesson plans that you try to include some variety. You try to include some sequencing, and always pay attention to timing and pacing. I find that when you're writing down this information, you want to let people know who will be using this if there are any problems with pacing or timing. When you're actually implementing a lesson, I do recommend that you look at your students, watch them, to find out whether you're going too fast or too slow, whether it's too easy or too difficult for them. So you want to gauge that difficulty, and you're doing that by observing your students. You want to be very observant. There are a lot of things involved in language teaching, and one of them is to notice whether your students are lost or not. They're going to speak to you without words oftentimes, and you need to be watching their actions and their reactions, right? Recognize there are going to be individual differences. You create a lesson, right? You have your objectives and your materials and procedures, and you go out and you begin to do this, and you begin to realize there are students that are having problems with something, or students that don't necessarily appreciate that type of an activity. You're going to find ways to work around that, but you can't do that unless you notice those differences. Also, when you're when you're doing a lesson, you need to recognize that for the most part, you as a teacher want to limit your teacher talk. You want your students to do most of the talking. Get them engaged in talking more. One of the reasons why I like pair work, actually there are two reasons. One is because of individual differences. I know there are some students who are deathly afraid to speak in a large group. So in order to circumvent that, I always have some type of activities during the class where students can work in pairs. It's just the two of them talking, and so now there's less pressure and they lower their affective filter. The other is to allow more students to talk, so there's more student talk going on by getting more people to get involved in the talking process. Remember that you may need to adapt your lessons to the established curriculum. And so when you're developing a lesson, you always need to remember what's the established curriculum, and how can I create materials to fit into that scheme already there. Classroom lesson notes, how much, what's the format, that's going to depend on you and your school. It may also depend on the people that you're working with, if you're going to be doing any team teaching. As a student, you may be required to present a lesson notes in great detail so that your teacher may know what you're doing, what is good and what isn't good. I'm not that much of a detail person, or at least not in comparison to some other teachers. I generally do not write out a script when I'm working with students. I don't write out what I'm going to say so that I can say it to them. I just have that in my head. This little discussion that we're having here, for example, wasn't written down. But there are some teachers who will want everything written down, the entire script written, and all of the procedures in great detail. That's going to be up to you and the school that you're in. Please bear in mind that when you do take notes, it's going to help whoever's coming next to teach your class when you do write notes. Now, if your notes become a small book, it may be that the teacher who comes in may not be interested in reading all of that information. So try to create it in such a way that it's helpful to someone coming in, but not so much so that you kill them with an overload of information. Let's take a look now at some techniques and materials. Last time, or several sessions ago, we talked a little bit about what a technique is, and we'll talk about what techniques are again here. We'll try to categorize them, and we'll also talk about good textbooks. Okay. So what's a technique? A technique is the lowest form in your method. Remember, a method included an approach, a design, and then procedures or techniques. And here you see we're using this word interchangeably. There are a number of ways that people use this word. They call it a task, they call it an activity, they call it a procedure. I would probably tend to use the word activity. A technique is a style of teaching. An activity is an actual thing that you do in class with your students. A task, very much popular now, primarily because of task-based language teaching, and how we give a student a task to complete, and then they focus on that particular task. They don't focus on language necessarily. An activity could be a number of types of not tools, any type of event in a classroom where students get together and work on some element of language, whether it's a functional type of activity where they get up and they play a language game, or whether it's a grammatical analysis, whether they're trying to create a story using new vocabulary. Any number of things that could constitute an activity. Procedure, again, they're going to be following a set of directions and trying to get a task completed through doing a procedure. Practice and behavior and exercise and strategy, all of these are types of things that are done while completing an activity. They may be doing a practice like a grammar translation practice or grammar drills type of practice. They may have a dialogue that they're practicing. That would also be considered an exercise. Strategies are a little different. It is a technique, but it's a technique for learning language, and there are strategies that you can give students to help them to learn new words, to get around problems, to get help from a native speaker. So all of these could be in the realm of technique. There are a lot of different things that are going on there, but all of these could be defined as a technique. So we've got techniques that are actual activities where you're doing something, and you also have techniques that are ways of learning, ways of doing things. All right, when we look at techniques, take a little bit look at the history of things. Well, we began years ago with something that Brown calls a manipulative. And that's where the objective was to convert information from one form to another, whether it was a translation, whether it was a drill. But it was more in the mechanics of doing things and less involved in the communication of the language. But that eventually changed with a number of researchers and linguists and their ideas, like Skinner, like Chomsky, like Gass, like Krashen and Ellis, and the things that they have done to move things more into a communicative type of objectives. And so the techniques have now changed as we moved along. It used to be more mechanical, and now it's becoming more meaning and the communicative drills. But now we've moved on to communicative type of activities. In the past, a lot of the things, as I said, were mechanical, and now we're moving to the more open-ended. I remember when I would study language, oftentimes there were multiple choice type of answers. And nowadays there are more and more activities that are open-ended. There is no one answer. Multiple ways of doing things, because that's the way language is. Language is open and free. So there are controlled types of activities that you can do. And then there are more free activities. By the way, the activities that we had done in the past, the techniques that have been done in the past, they're not bad. I would never say that they're bad. I would always say that they're insufficient. Okay, so they have a purpose. That's simply not enough. We need to do more. And although they were good, their primary focus was probably not the best location. Communicative skills would be much better. Of course, it does encompass everything, including those older techniques. Brown tries to develop a taxonomy of techniques, and he tries to describe techniques in terms of controlled, semi-controlled, and free types of techniques. Controlled techniques, and you can look at them here, role play, demo, question and answer, review, testing, dictation, translation. They're controlled activities, right? There's a limited number of things that you can do with them, limited number of answers, and they're not bad. There are some students who need that control, that limit, okay? You give them all this freedom and they can't handle it. They need that scaffolding around them to help guide them to those answers. And so there are some students who prefer these types of activities because it's more restrictive, especially for those who have less control over the language. Think of someone who's learning to ride a bicycle. Oftentimes, what do people do? But they put training wheels on the bicycle so that the kid can get a little used to riding before they take them off and teach them. And controlled is going to be more that way. They're things that are more limited. Semi-controlled techniques, again, you're taking off some of the barriers and allowing them to think more and to do more and to be more creative. Things like brainstorming, storytelling. I love those types of activities. Question and answer referential. Information transfer, information exchange. And it is limited, the information that you're doing, but it doesn't have to be done in a specific manner. Wrap-ups, narration. One that I would add here is giving directions. I used to do an activity where I would have two students sitting facing each other, and this student could see in the back here a picture. And they would try to describe to this student sitting here who can't see the picture how to draw it. So there's this giving directions. Okay, there's no one way to do this, but it's a fun activity. It's again semi-controlled. Finally, there are free techniques. It's just wide open. Role playing, for example. There is no script that's involved. You simply just go do it. Reporting. writing, problem solving, doing a drama, again, unscripted, doing a simulation, doing an interview. These are free. I have no idea what's going to happen with those. And so these are more real life. There's very little scaffolding involved. And but these are activities that you can use, especially with students who are brave and or have a greater control of the language. All right, let's take a look at textbooks. In the world of ESL, there are dozens and dozens of textbooks. For the most part, I do not like them. This is just me personally. Because there are so many materials that are available online. Because there is so much material that is already available to you. Why in the world do you want to make your students pay for stuff that's freely available to you? Now, it means more work for the teacher. It means that the teacher now has to organize the materials they're going to use for that particular semester. And they need to organize it. They need to have it ready, go find it and or create it and make it available. Means that they need to have all of these materials ready to go for their students. And also be able to hand out. Now, there are some teachers who say, I don't have the time to do that, or I don't know how to do that. They'll get a textbook. The textbook will provide them the materials and information that they need. If you're going to go out and get a textbook, however, you should evaluate the book. How well is it put together? Does it have all of the components that are going to be necessary for you? What's the approach of the textbook? Is it more indirect or more direct as far as language teaching? Do they teach all the skills or don't they? Do they, how's the quality of the actual book? Do they have good sections in it, like supplemental materials? Does it have a sequencing? More importantly, does it have a scope and a sequence? Does it show you at the beginning of the book what's the scope and sequence? Does it show you the vocabulary that you're using? Typically in an ESL, EFL program, the goal is to get through the core of the common vocabulary, which is the first 2,000 to 3,000 words. And so you want to make sure that your textbooks are actually covering that. Do they list those things? Do they talk about psycholinguistic factors? Is the format of the book appropriate? Are you going to go through this quickly? Is it only on paper? Do they have a website? So there are a lot of things that you want to look at when you're working with a textbook. Some textbooks do better because it's only dealing with one particular area. Maybe it's a reading textbook or it's a writing textbook. And so the focus is going to be more limited. Other things in supplementals, like does it have a glossary? Does it have an index? Does it have supplemental things in the back? Does it have a word list? If there are reading segments, does it have summary notes on the side, or does it have pre-reading activities? Things that are going to help your student master these materials more quickly. Textbooks are not a bad thing. As someone who's been teaching for a while, I prefer not to have a textbook and to use materials that I have either created or collected over time. And so that's just me. Your school may require you to use a textbook, and that's fine as well. But evaluate the textbook. Make sure that it's useful. It's good. It's good for your class. It provides good information. It's well made and includes a lot of the many of the elements that you should be looking for that are listed here. There are other types of resources that are out there. There are books that are simply a resource book. These are excellent books to have. I do remember at one point a book of drawings, pictures, not photographs, but drawn pictures. One I remember was a picture of a park, and there must have been, 50 people in the park doing all these different things. And it was a great tool. First of all, I could copy it. That was a legal thing that it allowed you to do. So I'd make copies, and I would have students ask each other questions. What's this? What's that? What's he doing? What's she doing? And they could look at the picture. It was a nice piece of material. You can have real things that you can bring in and use those as an object for learning language. You can create visuals. You can have commercially made visuals, and I have a huge book, not a huge book, a huge box full of pictures that are used for language learning and language teaching. And you can use them for any number of things. And so there are a lot of materials out there. I didn't talk at all about computer-based materials. And there are hundreds of those sites out there of things at your disposal. Of course, there are things made for native speakers that you can use as well. So there is a ton of materials that are out there that you can use, and also that you can use them with different techniques that we had talked about earlier. And that's all for techniques and lesson planning. If you do have any questions, please let me know. I'll be glad to answer them. Bye-bye now. Talk to you later.